Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Today, we are looking at chapter 13 of Book 1. It's the final chapter of Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, and we will turn now to it. It wraps up the introduction, and that we could say, right? Um, Now, since happiness is a certain activity of soul in accord with complete virtue, arete, right? What concerns virtue would have to be examined. So therefore, we've dealt with happiness. This is the transition to virtue. Here begins our transition to virtue, right? The text is that we had the introduction of what was the best way of life, the question of good, what is the good, the question of the good life, what is good life, happiness, what is meant by happiness. Actually, no, this is a plug for something. Um, I would, if you want to look at the question of, and the question of happiness is something really big. I know I haven't gotten Gadsag's new book. I wish I could get some. I'm gonna beg you guys, send me a Amazon. If someone wants to send me a Amazon card, please do so. You know who I am. You can always follow me Bates at Clifford Bates. You can follow me at my university address. Um, why? Because I like to get the Gadsad book on happiness and the other thing. But here is the other thing. This is a very good thing by what's her name? Susan Mayer. Susan Mayer, classicist. I think she's at Yale. No, she's at University of Pennsylvania, right? And she has, and in fact, you can find her lecture on ancient philosophy online, and I'd recommend it given what I've seen of her work. This is what I call this series the Princeton how-to version. It's great because it has the Greek. It does both Greek and English, and also the introductions to the chapters are kind of introduction of the things. This takes out. It's not a complete translation of the ethics. Rather, it takes the whole question of happiness from all the various books of the ethics and puts it under kind of a Nicomachean Ethics, a kind of examination of the question of how happiness, how to flourish, right? Because what is this flourish? Eudaimonia, how to be happy, right? Um, um, this is a very good tool to those who want to start, who are looking at the question of happiness. Um, I would recommend you getting this in that sense. And if you want to learn some Greek, you can do the same thing because it has the English on one side and the Greek on the other. And the translation is a very decent. It's not. It's not. It is. It's not. It's a little more friendly to people than the translation I'm using here. In that sense, which is more Greek. It's more literal to the Greek. This one isn't. This is kind of more crisp and to the current readers understand it in that sense. But then there's the Greek right next door. See, this is why you can do that, and you can do that, and you can do this because the Greek is right next to it in the various texts in a very interesting way, right? And then the comments and things like this or summarizations sometimes at chapters are put in italics. Now, why am I mentioning it now in the middle of my 13? Well, because I've been thinking about it. I might even talk about it in a Friday video, but we'll see what happens. So let's go to activity of soul, and what virtue has before. Right now, we said that what concerns virtue would have to be examined. For perhaps in this way we might better contemplate, theorize, happiness as well. So we better, in other words, better theoretically understand what happiness is as well. For the politician, it is true. For the politician, in the true sense, seems to have labored over this especially, for he wishes to make the citizens good in obedience to the laws. In other words, the question of happiness, the question of what is the good life, and I think this is what we have to understand. Happiness, as eudaimonia, is a kind of flourishing. Again, this is a Martha Nussbaum in her famous articles of the 1990s on the question of flourishing. The question is and I here I will agree with Nussbaum of the 90s, not Nussbaum of the 2000s and 2000 later. The earlier Nussbaum is much more find agreeable and understandable on this point, and I think she's right. Now, of course, she takes it too far and she radicalizes it, but later in her career, and as she particularly as she turns and tries to take the Stoics' conception of happiness and run with it, which I think is a distortion of the Aristotelian understanding of eudaimonia. So the politicians seem to have labored over this. Right, the question of happiness is something that really, because they want to understand how to make citizens good and obedient and obey the laws in that sense. Right, we have as models of these the lawgivers of the Cretians and the Lacedaemonians. The lawgiver of the Cretians, of course, is a Chronos, not Chronos. It is. What is it? It is Minos. Okay, not Chronos. Minos. Minos, who is said to be like godlike. He was a son of Lycurgus. He was also the king of the Cretians. The lawgiver of Cretians, Minos, and you have to remember there's a Platonic dialogue dedicated to Minos, right? Some people argue that it is the appendix to the laws, right? But okay, but it's not the laws on a Platonic dialogue, even though it's Plato wrote it. It's not a Socratic dialogue in the sense that Socrates is not a character, but the Athenian stranger. I have to go check. I don't remember my God, I'm forgetting the Minos. I think Socrates is in the Minos. I haven't read the Minos in over 40 years. I was an undergraduate when I did Plato completely. So, and then next, so if the lawgivers of the Cretians, and then the lawgivers of the Lacedaemonians, is of course Lycurgus, right? The great Lycurgus, and any other of that sort that there may have been. Notice again, the focus here is the Cretians and the Lacedaemonians. These are said to be people who have produced great cities, the great political communities. In fact, this is repeated in Aristotle's Politics, Book 2, and why he addresses, okay, what are the cities that are held to be best, right? Best in terms of held to be best. Well, two of the three he mentioned is Crete and Lacedaemon, right? Lacedaemon first, Crete second. The third one is not even Greek. It is a non-Greek city. It's Carthage. Who is he silent about in Book 2 of the Politics? Athens is missing. Athens is missing here also. Athens is and Solon. The question of Solon or Cleisthenes, founder of, remember, Solon is said to be. There's three founders we can say of Athens. The question of Athenian founding. One is it Theseus, Athena. The myth is of Athena, the children of Athena, Athens. That of Theseus. So Athens is a problematic entity. Is it Athena, the children of Athena, and that's the classic mythos of it? Then Theseus, okay, said to be the king legislator, but he's not the real legislator in the sense. He'd be Solon, the great Solon, and who Aristotle will praise at the end of Book 2 of the Politics. And he's praised earlier about the question of earlier in the question of happiness, how, the famous line from Solon, never judge anyone happy to the end of their life, right? And then the third question is Cleisthenes, the man who gives Athens its a form of democracy after the argument of Solonian democracy was kind of the farmer middle class democracy, and Cleisthenes is the democracy of Athens that emerged after the great naval victory, and it's the more radical democracy, the democracy of the Benisoi, right? Of the laborers, and the laborers who were the oarmen who led Athens to victory. So it is silent about this. He goes, if this examination is part of, in other words, if this examination of virtue is a part of the political art, it is clear that the investigation would be in accord with the choice made at the beginning. Okay, so therefore, what is the choice made? In other words, the question of what is the best way of life. Okay, what is the best way of life? What is what is the good for that way of what good does that way of life bring about? And we have assumed that good is happiness, right? In that sense. So therefore, if the examination is part of the political, so if the examination of the question here, we're going to be turning, we've gotten what to understand happiness better, right? To better happiness, we need to perhaps address the question of virtue, particularly since we said that happiness emerges through complete virtue. Therefore, we must what concerns virtue would have to be examined. Right, that's the whole point of the transition. Right, the transition here is a transition to virtue. What virtue is, and therefore the question of what virtue is part. It concerns the political art in the sense, since we're concerned with what happiness is, right? So therefore, if it is clear that that the investigation would be in accord with the choice made at the beginning of the things we argue. Now, I go so now continue. But what we must, but that we must examine the virtue distinctive of a human being is clear. So therefore, the question of virtue, not in general, but of virtue of human being. For we are seeking both the human good and human happiness. So therefore, we must focus on the human, not the gods, not the divine, not something, in other words, not the good itself, not the good or happiness itself as the concept, a kind of pure concept, but a human good and human happiness. We mean by the virtue distinctive to human being, not of that of the body, but that of the soul. And by happiness, we mean the activity of the soul, so the human soul in that sense, right? The human soul is so Greek word here, soul, psyche. Now we can understand this as the word psyche and what the soul means. Is this the mind? We can see this as the intellect, the mind in that sense. Aristotle does not. He uses the more. Aristotle uses the old word that and the concept of the soul. What is the soul? The soul is it in this sense the soul is the consciousness in that sense. Or is it consciousness in the sense we understand it? This is modern. What is meant by soul? Is it the it's the whole of us as human being. It is a thing that defines us, and particularly our intellect, our mind, our the soul also has, where we talk about the soul, the intellectual part. The soul is composed of multiple parts. It is composed not. It is composed. It is one part that deals with the intellect, the rational, logos, speech, and the other one deals with spirit, right? Which the spirit also ties to the body, right? And the desiring. So that's the famous tripartite thing that from Plato onwards, and I think even Aristotle would agree with this. That what the three parts of the soul is: the desiring, the spirited in that sense, the thematic, um, and lastly the reasoning. But let's continue, right? But what do we meant? In happiness, we mean we mean an activity of the soul. But if these things are so, then it is clear that the politician ought to know in some way about the soul, just as also someone who is going to treat the eye must know the whole body as well. Even more so, in so much as the political art is more honorable and better than medicine. Wait a minute, wait a minute, whoa, whoa, whoa. First of all, the argument is the eye. Person who does the eye needs to understand to be able to treat the eye well. He has to know the body. So medicine, the idea of the that this art is tied to the medical art, but and therefore the idea the politician needs to know the soul. Now, because the soul is tied to, this is a problem. Us, the modern liberal, the modern, and particularly the modern liberal, whose liberalism is an idea that emerges out of modern thought, right? Um, don't like this. The idea that it doesn't want the soul is the private. The soul is not the. In other words, in many ways, the modern is a kind of offshoot also of the Christian. the Christian, the idea, and you see this in even Saint Augustine, that the idea is that the ancients are just wrong. Saint Augustine, City of God, he dismisses the ancient Platonic concern about the political, that the political is about being virtuous, about the best way of life, and about the soul, because it is the ancients understood this as soulcraft, right? Politics is soulcraft. I'm going to steal the. I'm going to point. Didn't in the late 1980s, George Will write this? This is in fact his first really George Will, famous columnist, and now kind of a champion of Trump derangement disorder. And his books tend to be more kind of his columns put together than real books. But this book's politics is, in fact, this is a book that I remember at the time all my Straussian teachers, the West Coast Straussians, hated because he had kind of was agreeing with the East Coast Straussians and critiquing of American and accepting that the modern thinking, not liking in Will and statecraft as soulcraft. In fact, the later Will repudiates the early Will. Okay, this is funny in that sense. In fact, this is kind of what they say the East Coast Straussian, that the moderns are not the moderns, and particularly America, being a modern society, aren't necessarily good in that sense, because if America rests on Lockean and Hobbesian frameworks of kind of a lowering of virtue, or not concerning with virtue, but lowering the end of man down to material things. It is a rejection of it is accepting the modern rejection of the soul and the soulcraft. The idea that soulcraft is the end of politics, and politics should concern ourselves with souls. This is seen to be no. Let's aim for a more lower and obtainable thing. That's the famous argument. And what Will in the book Statecraft or Soulcraft seems to defend the idea that no, we should go back to Soulcraft, right? That politics is Soulcraft, caring of the characters. And at the time, this, oh my God, this is an attack on American politics. And in many ways, this is funny. If you go back to George Will's first 1980, I forget, 86, 87 book, Politics as Soulcraft, you really hit on Patrick Deneen's, his book on liberalism, his classic book on liberalism, and also the regime change book. Patrick Deneen's, this is funny. Patrick Deneen's is why liberalism failed and his regime change. His position criticizing liberalism like this echoes that of the early Will, but today's Will, George Will of today, repudiates his Will. And looks at Deneen as, oh my God, Deneen's a fascist. And in other words, around the late 1990s, early thousands, or late 1990s, mid 1990s, George Will abandoned his earlier position in his first book. In fact, one rarely sees his first book. There's no real desire to republish his first book. But his first book, and I would joke, Will's first book and Deneen's kind of position are kind of similar in that sense. And this is why this question of politics is a kind of soulcraft, right? So we have to understand that. So he says we're dealing with this. The politician needs to understand the soul, right? But again, this is something in St. Augustine. St. Augustine kind of rejects this. St. Augustine says, oh, no. Soul is the realm of God and the Holy Church. And that political understanding of this will be always imperfect and always understanding. And therefore, and this is what leads why there's kind of, in politics. In fact, we can argue Augustine's critique of the ancients on the question of the politics of soulcraft leads Augustine to reject the idea that politics is about soulcraft. That the church, soulcraft should be left to the church, and politics should take care of the mere body. And this is the origin. We can argue that maybe that we could maybe argue this is the origins of the early that modernity is not really found in the the origins of modernity may be found with Christianity in the sense. Ooh. Ooh. Okay, that's a radical thing that's beyond the scope of what we're doing here. So, in other words, this idea, but I also have this idea that politics is more noble than medicine. This is this ancient idea that it's the architectonic art that medicine serves the good. What is the medicine that serves the good of the body is also serving the good of the political community. Okay, the political art is the idea that we are live together. And what is a political? Now this is, oh my God, collectivism. Oh, I can hear the Ayn Randians and the radical liberal libertarians. Oh my God, this is radical collectivism that where you live for the collective. No, this is because we live in real communities. Human being is not able to exist as the sole individual alone and outside of a community of other people. And they need to live in a community, and it's healthy for them. So the purpose of what medicine does, the health is for the sake of living, right? Health is for the sake of living and living well, not only mere living, but living beautifully. So this is the whole point that we have to talk about. That's why the political art is more honorable than medicine. Those physicians who are refined take very seriously that what pertains to knowledge of the body. And the politician too ought to contemplate the soul, but he ought to contemplate it for the sake of these things and up to the point that is adequate for what is being sought. In other words, it's not. This is the limit. Aristotle is making an argument that yes, the politician should care the soul, but it's not to understand the soul and the soul for its own sake, but to understand the soul in the sake of being able to that human beings can live well together, live well. Okay, it's use. In other words, there's a kind of a use. Not it's not its understanding of it is not to understand it for the sake um, of contemplation of it on its own terms, but in terms of its action. In that sense, the concern of its action in practice and activity in that sense, right? You ought to complete it for the sake of these things, and up to that point, that is what adequate for what is being sought. To be more precise is perhaps too difficult given the task set forth. In other words, to be, in other words, the precision of what is expected of the understanding of the soul. If you expect too much precision of the understanding of the soul, this goes beyond what is being asked. Why are you doing this? The why you're doing this. Okay. But some points concerning the soul are stated sufficiently even in the esoteric arguments, and one ought to make use of them. For example, that one part of it is non-rational and another possesses reason. Evident. Now the question is, what is meant by the esoteric arguments? Evidently, a reference to writings intended for a wider or more popular audience. See note 26, a real earlier note. Um, there's the argument that Aristotle wrote a bunch of dialogues. We've lost the dialogues. In other words, popular writings. In other words, at some point, the soul are stated sufficiently, even in the exoteric arguments. Now, I'm going to suggest that what is being meant here is meant literally. I think that, in other words, by the esoteric arguments, these are the arguments people make all the time. Yeah, I don't necessarily believe that there's argument that Aristotle wrote dialogues, okay, but I'm not sure that the argument here is about necessarily about the missing dialogues, the public dialogues. It's about basically, even in other words, but some point, in other words, even in exoteric, the kind of exoteric arguments that are covers to more deeper esoteric analysis. Now, this is, we can say, the difference between exoteric are kind of the public, the audience, general in that sense, and the broader, and the esoteric are the more specific and more kind of nitpicking and more uh, 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 precise in that sense. And this is, it actually makes sense given the previous, what came about the question of precision, right? The previous point was the question of how much precision is necessary, and maybe we don't need that. The political man needs only the precision that allows it the question of its usefulness, not to get too deep into it, not to go down the rabbit hole, right? That when you go in esotericism, when you go down the esoteric, you may go down a rabbit hole to go beyond what is useful to what you're getting to the higher levels of truth in that sense. So, okay, the esoteric argument, and one ought to make use of them. For example, that one part, in other words, what is that? The esoteric argument is that one part of it is non rational, another possesses reason. So the soul has what? A non rational part, and another possesses reason. Yet, whether these things are divided, like the parts of the body, and every divisible thing, or whether they are two in speech, but naturally inseparable, like the convex and the concave in the circumference of the circle, makes no difference with the view to the present tense. So, in other words, this is a very point. He goes, okay, for the view of what we're trying to accomplish at the political, it makes no difference if the question of the soul is whether they are really divided or are they really like the example of the concave, the convex and the convex circumcircum circle. They're only two in speech, but one in reality. Are they separate things, or are they just merely one thing that language that we mentally separate, we logically separate to have a better explanation, but in truth are one, right? This makes no difference. This question is not important to the view of the present task. Of the non-rational, okay, so we get the point. Of the non-rational, one part seems to be that which is held to be common and vegetative. I mean that which causes nutrition and growth. For okay, this idea of the non-rational, right? We have one part that we divide again. One part is vegetative; it's nutrition and growth. For someone could posit that such a capacity of soul is in all things that are nourished and in embryos, and that this same capacity is present in the completed thing as well. For this is more rational than positing some other capacity. So, in other words, let's keep this idea of the vegetative. Now, this is it's more makes more sense to accept that there is this other thing than generate some new other capacity. Right? A certain virtue belongs to this capacity. Then appears to be common and not distinctive of a human being. So this is something, the virtue of the vegetative in that sense is something common and not distinctive of a human being. For this part and its capacity seems particularly active in sleep, but the good person and the bad would at least, but the good person and the bad would be least distinct in sleep, right? The idea, wait a minute. So this is a bracket here. So it is that people assert that for half of life, the happy do not differ at all from the wretched, and this is to be expected. Sleep is an idleness for that in reference to which the soul is said to be serious or base. In other words, sleep is an idleness for that of that in reference to which the soul is said, thus to be the question. The soul itself is said to be serious or base. In other words, bodios, or base, or something vile, right? Unless that is, certain motions do reach them to a small degree, in which the way the dreams of the decent are better than those at random. Okay, 72 decent. The word is epektikes here in general sense, the decent or the equitable, or in regards to just, which is discussion in equity in book 5, in chapter 10, right? The epikitis, the Greek word here is the epikitis, the decent, the, the equitable, right? And I think this is the thing. This actually, there's a psychology here. There's an implicit psychology here that even, in other words, that at one sense the soul, in sleep we're not that, but the question of goodness and badness, he says, unless certain motions, notice this, the word physical, motions. So good, evil, and good, seriousness, the spodion, the things that are tied to the spodion versus those of the base, the vicious in that sense, right? Are motions that therefore that these motions affect us in our sleep rest, our, in idleness. Our sleep is an idleness. So the emotions of baseness and virtue, of things of the spodion, which is maybe virtue in that sense, goodness. In other words, are in other words that the general a person in red. In other words, he seems to say that maybe they affect us to a degree that this is why we say that the dreams. This is why in Shakespeare plays like Henry the and Richard III, that poor where Richmond is the dreams which Richmond has are kind of rising and just, where the dreams of Richard is haunting and damning, right? That ending, that scene before the battle, and near the end of Richard III. In other words, the dreams that in Shakespeare kind of portray this idea that the idea that our vice, the vice, our injustice, our in things, are going to affect. And he doesn't even say that. He just implies that the just. Now, this is, again, someone always said to me, Strauss told his students, and his students, I was a student of many of his students. Leo Strauss always often said that Aristotle is kind of a nice guy. He doesn't like to explicitly say the bad things, like Xenophon in that sense. And when he does, then therefore when he says bad things, it's shocking. Okay, usually Aristotle wants to cover up, like Xenophon, to cover the bad, and only speak of the good, right? Therefore, he speaks only here of the equitable, right? The dreams of the decent or the equitable. It's interesting. Those who have equitable, who are decent people, who are equitable in that sense, are better than those at random. But enough of these things. Let us now. But enough. Let the narrative part be, since it does not naturally share in human virtue. In other words, it exists in all. It's not something that's specifically human. Yet there is to be also a certain other nature of the soul that is non-rational, although it does share with reason in a way. For in the case of the self-restrained person and the one lacking in self-restraint, we praise their reason, and that part of the soul possessing reason, since it correctly exhorts them towards the best things. In other words, the discussion of the distinction between the person of self-restraint, the person who lacks self-restraint. It is their reason and the part of the soul that possesses reason that helps them, the self-restrained person, to be restrained, right? But there appears to be something else in them that that is by nature contrary to reason, which does battle with and strains against reason. So therefore, it's not only the vegetative, there's another part of it. For just as when we choose to move paralyzed parts of the body to the right, and they, on the contrary, borne off to the left, so also with the soul. And impulses of those lacking self-restraint are towards are towards things contrary to their reason. Period. So therefore, this idea that something that moves us. So in other words, we think we want it to move it this way, but instead of the body, something it moves the other way, right? Something contrary to what we intend or what we do. Yet, whereas in the case of bodies, we see the things being borne off. In the case of the soul, we do not see it. So therefore, in bodies, we see the disconnect between what we want to do versus what we do. We want it to go this way, but it goes that way, right? Um, but in the soul, we may not. It's imperceivable in that sense, right? But perhaps we must hold there to be no less in the case of the soul too, something contrary to reason that opposes and blocks it. So what is this? What appears to be blocks it? How uh, how how it is different does not matter at all. So therefore, the question of the body and the soul, the thing that gets the body to act opposite than what we want it to act. We want it to move right, but it moves left. And what the question that we see it in terms of the body, but is it the same thing? He wants to say it is the same thing. It appears to, in other words, as we said, in the case of the self-restrained person, in other words, let's go. He goes, how different it doesn't matter at all. It too appears to share in reason, as what is it said? In other words, it shares in reason. It is share something. It is something opposed to reason. Let's continue. Born off, perhaps one must hold there to be no less in case this all too something contrary to reason that oppose and block it. How it is different does not matter at all. It too appears to share in reason, as it is said. In the case of the self-restrained person, at any rate, it is obedient to the commands of reason, and perhaps it heeds those commands still more readily in the case of the moderate, the sophosunes, right, the moderate or courageous person. Um, the sophos, I think it's sophosunes, right? That is moderate. I think he's doing moderate sophosunes. Yeah, this is step 113. This is 1202. 1202B. 2530, right? Yeah, it is. It's soft. They're translating it moderate in that sense. In that sense, it's, the question here is the self-restraint is obedient to the commands of reason. In other words, he's obedient to the commands of reason, and perhaps heeds those commands in more readily ways in the case of the modern person, since then it is in all respects in harmony with reason. In other words, there's agreement. There's an agreement with reason. There's a harmony. Harmony is when the different things kind of are in accord with each other, right? Is lack of discord is when they're not. They're opposite. They're working against. Here, these two things, um, uh, reason and are. I think he's going to talk about desire here, right? This is that logic. This is what Plato would talk about, is right. Harmony with it appears, therefore, that the non-rational part of the soul is twofold. For the vegetative part has nothing in common with reason, but that part characterized by desire or excess, right, and by longing in general, right, shares somehow in reason in as much as it heeds it, listens to it. It follows it, obeys it, or heeds it. Heeds, the words heed. Heeds means like kind of comply with it. It obeys it. He chooses heeds a kind of following it, obeying it, right? Heeds it and is apt to be obedient to its command. So this is what heed is used like. Yeah, the animal heeds it. Like, oh, this is the metaphor of heating is the word we would use in English to talk about an animal which you're controlling at the harness, right? It is something that someone who's some kind of either the voice or something is forcing it to leads it to comply. When the parent yells at the child's or the parent's voice tell don't do that. The commit the what is the word? The directed comment, that raising of the voice, the thing like that, may lead the child and to instead of doing what he was doing to heed, obey, and that um, um, and obeyed to the commands, right? Thus, we assert that he who is in this way obedient to the commands of the Father and friends in some way possesses reason, and not as he does so in the manner of someone knowledgeable in mathematics. In other words, the father and friends, and it was reason, but it's not. In other words, the desiring being and how it complies with reason operates differently than how you'd say the mathematician dealing with the truth and falsehood of a mathematical thing. Again, the difference here is that we could argue that the mathematical realm is the realm. I mean, we don't get to this. The difference between praxis, action, a level of praxis versus the level of theoria. Here we're dealing with the realm of the body, the desire, the realm of desire, which is bodily, right? It is tied to the body in that sense. It's the soul, but it's also tied to. It is that. Remember, this is the famous line in Aristotle's Metaphysics, and also in his, I think, even his De Anima, that without desire there's no motion, right? There's no motion without desire, and therefore this is why we do what we do in that sense. Um, um, that the non-rational part is somehow persuaded by reason is indicated both by admonition, that means criticism, and we are being, oh, don't do that, and by criticism, as well as exhortation. See, admonition is negative, like don't do that, you should not do that. Is exhortation is, well, positive. So criticism is okay, like, and by all, in other words, by admonitions, by criticism, but as well as by exhortations, positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement, criticism, kind of like a negative, but at the same time, maybe criticism is trying to make you better, right? This is just don't do it. Criticism is you're doing it wrong. Here you can do it better, and this is okay. This is what you should do, right? But if we must assert that this part too possesses reason, then that which possesses reason would be twofold as well. What possesses it in the authoritative sense, and in itself, and on the one hand, and on the other, that what has it in the sense of being apt to listen as one does to one's father. So therefore, the rational, he says, the rational, there's two. If the desiring is this aspect, but that he says that the rational part is two sets. That one is that it's authoritative. Reason is authoritative. It will do it. In other words, the rational part that is authoritative means that it will simply obey, simply do it. But then there is one that a sense of being that is that we listen and we're apt to do it, but we're not compelled to do it in that sense. It's like you, as one would listen to one's father, we would incline to do it, but then we can disobey, and that's where, and this is where we can maybe say the question of self-restraint comes in here, right? So virtue. This is the last paragraph and last paragraph of the chapter and the book. Virtue too is defined in accord with this distinctive. For we say that some virtues are intellectual, of the mind, right, of the intellect, and others are moral. Now here's 73. Ethikos, here in the plural, from ethos, from ethos sharing the word at 1-3, and above as the plural adjective in the title of the work. When used in relation to virtue and the virtues, we always translate as moral, in deference to traditional translations, the moral virtue. Eh. Other ethical. I think this is it. Some are. I think the question of moral, right? This is the ethics. The ethicate is we're translating ethikos, ethos. The ethikos, others ethikos. So intellect and ethikos. Ethikos seems to be the question. Some virtues are intellectual; they're tied to the intellect. And I think intellectual here is okay. No. I'm sorry. We're gonna end here, and it's like, oh my God, they're gonna get there. Um, yeah. The last word is the character. No. Okay, intellectual. Intellectual here is nous. Um, some virtues are intellectual, and others are. Others are moral. Now these are wisdom, Sophia, comprehension, um, kai. Yeah, Sophia, man, kai. Comprehension. It's interesting in that comprehension, um, um, and phonesis, a prudence, are being intellectual, but liberality, and mat sophosune being moral in that sense. Um, uh, um, uh, Sophosune and Eleutherene, and so it being, ethikes, okay, being tied to character. The question, yeah, I would say, and he talks about here, right? He goes being moral. So therefore, these wisdom, Sophia, comprehension. This comprehension would be this. Sophia Kai. It is a suvera sulin. That's not. It's something he won't clearly address in book 6 later. Okay, this is what we addressed in book 6. Wisdom, comprehension, and prudence are being of the mind or intellectual, right? Liberality and moderation being of the moral, that is, character of the body, in that sense, of our bodily action, in that sense. And more questions of character, in that sense. That's what the difference between intellectual virtue and moral virtue. Speak now. As we go into here, we will go into the discussion of. We'll start with the moral virtues, the virtues of character, and then in book 6, we will get to the so-called intellectual virtues. Right. For in speaking about someone's character, we do not say that he is wise or comprehending, but that he is gentle or moderate. In other words, so therefore, we praise the wise person too, with respect to the characteristic that is his, and we say that of the characteristics the of characteristics, the praiseworthy ones are virtue. So of the characteristics, the ones we praise, these are the virtue. The ones we condemn or criticize are the vices. So therefore, this is the famous idea of this idea of the characteristics of the ethics and the moral virtues, as the tradition translates ethicae, in this sense as moral. The ethicae that we're concerned here, in this sense, not as opposed, this is a weird thing. He then speaks of the virtues that deal with the ethicae, and then the tradition has constantly translated as moral. Okay, that's why this is odd. This is, in other words, I think this is an attempt that they're submitting to the tradition, and if they kept the ethic, and keep the ambiguity that the Greek here really does leave us here, that the other is ethical, but what is meant by ethical here? Ethical is not ethics. This is that weird thing, intellectual and ethical. The tradition wants us to translate as moral. That we divide this between and the ethical here in this sense is the ethics. The ethical here deals with our character, whereas the idea here deals with the question of intellect. The intellectual virtues are not separate from the ones of our what he says are being with the ethical in that sense, our character in that sense. And this idea that the ethical here, it deals with character and the characters that are praiseworthy. This is how he ends. And these are the virtues in that sense. The things that we praise are the virtuous. Okay, that's where we end here. Put any comments or questions below. And when I see them, I'll respond to them. I hope you enjoyed it in that sense. If you really liked it, hit the like button. Please hit the like button. It would help us get some more attention. If you've liked it, please share it. Share it with other people. Share it in your social media. Get some attention. If you've not subscribed, please subscribe. Share it with others to encourage them to subscribe. If not to our new discussion on the ethics, then maybe to the other discussions that I've dealt with, Aristotle's Politics and other works. If you didn't like it, okay, you can say no, but say why in the comments. That way we can learn. If you want to follow me on social media, my links to social media are below. If you want to know about me as a scholar and see my research and check out my research, you can do so on my academic social media links below the normal social media links. And below that, if you want to and more than that, if you want to help me to do what I do, financially in that sense, you can do so through Patreon or Subscribestar. Either way, it would help. This life is a way that you can help in that sense. Other way you can help is to buy one of my 3 books that I've listed. The links, the title of the book. You can buy it through any means, Amazon, or if you buy the Lulu book, best do it by Lulu. I'll get more money, but do it by Amazon or anyone else. Okay, well that's it. We finished book 1. We turn next time. We'll start book 2, chapter 1 of book 2, and that's it for the day. Well, okay. See you next time, and have a good one. Take care. Bye bye.